Harvard Divinity School.
Uses and abuses of power in alternative spiritualities. Implications for spiritual care of patients and communities. April 28, 2023.
Good morning, humans. Good morning to all of you folks on Zoom as well. I want to start by thanking the conference organizers and Kimberly and Em and my fellow panelists and those of you for joining us this morning. Allow me to begin by first asking if anyone here today or joining us via Zoom identifies as a shaman. I can't see everybody on Zoom. Em, are you seeing anyone with a hand raised? No? Okay. Well, that makes my life easier today. So, I'm just kidding. So I've been inspired to compose these remarks by my own experience of working with shamans in Mongolia, in Buryatia, and in Tuva, mostly on Fox language that's spoken by shamans in Uvs-Aimag while in ecstasis. And then coming back to the United States and meeting white Americans who identify as shamans. Some had experienced transformational psychedelic world shifts, and others had been initiated through expensive courses. Now, this confusion was seconded only by my experience in my college cafeteria of being approached by a student who said to me, "Hi, I hear you do exorcisms. My friend had an exorcism. She thought it was absolutely fantastic. Can you do an exorcism for me?" Which made me want to run away. Like, are you possessed by a demon? If so, I'm out of here. But like, there's just also this fundamental notion of what's happening with these categories in terms of people's interest in them versus their identification of them or their experiences of certain practices and techniques. So today I'm going to explore the ongoing and evolving harm caused by the misuse of the term shaman and shamanism. I'm going to do something a bit different in my presentation and will forego screening images so that I don't make you look at Michel Foucault for 15 minutes. Just kidding. And I'm trusting you each. I'm also trusting you each have a general sense of what a shaman looks like already, although I suspect most of you conjure different images to match this concept. I also intend to be a bit edgy or provocative and proposing a corrective to a pattern both in academia and in the context of new spiritual movements by suggesting that in most instances, we abstain from further use of the terms shaman and shamanism. Particularly in light of alternative spiritualities in the Euro-American context, we encounter rising identification of shamanism as a religion among white practitioners. I would refer you to the works of Seddon in 2022. The word shaman comes to us from the Evenk Tungus verbal root sa, which is to do or to perform. A shaman is one who does or performs. Specifically, in the cultural complexes of Central and Northern Eurasia and circumpolar regions, a shaman is someone who, on behalf of a community or of an ill member of the community, does something public and performative. They enter into a state of ecstasy or ecstasis, often with the assistance of a helper and a drum, and thereby travel out of their body, often with the assistance of a helper spirit, to the realms of the spirits in order to placate, bribe, battle, negotiate with, or steal from the spirits the soul of the ill member of the community and bring the soul back into the body. They do not consume ayahuasca. They do not become possessed by gods, or typically wear horned helmets into the US Capitol building. Shamans do not typically choose to be shamans. The word shaman does not mean indigenous holy person. Although communities that do have shamans are typically indigenous communities. Instead, globally, Indigenous peoples have their own names for their own ritual and spiritual specialists. It's only in the last half century, thanks or no thanks, in large part to Mircea Eliade's opus Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, was published in 1951, that the terms shaman and shamanism have become so diluted. Initially, following Eliade, the adjectival shamanic as a category of religiosity began to be painted mostly onto various indigenous traditions as part of a colonial scholarly movement to discern proto-religiosity and particular characteristics of universal human experience. Here I refer you to the works of Keho, Hutton, Opal. In the ensuing decades, the term was engaged as a functional category glue in which to characterize any indigenous ritual expert, from a Tibetan oracle to an Upper Amazonian healer. In addition, the descriptor of shamanism was used to characterize entire traditions of meaning-making and ritual, with the adjectival shamanic used to describe indigenous peoples from Australia to Nepal, and from Islam to various traditions of Native North Americans. The methodological problematics of Eliade's project were perpetuated and evolved alongside the New Age into the 21st century and remain prominent in new religious and spiritual movements. See Jenkins, Nemesky, Swancutt, and Mazard in 2018. Eliade and others, most notably Joseph Campbell, strove to identify characteristics of shamanism, from flight to ecstasis, ecstasy, trance, from the use of drums in ritual to animal transformation. Thus, the term shamanic became a category descriptor employed to describe aspects of larger traditions, pieces of larger traditions. For example, the flight of the prophet, peace be upon him, was described as shamanic, not Islam writ large as shamanism, but a piece of the tradition. So it was a word used to describe parts of all kinds of traditions, but one that nevertheless either relegated cultural and religious traditions into a vague box or served to specify certain specifics of a tradition, such as flight, and thereby subtly categorize the larger tradition. The intent here was not always nefarious, as the scholars who did this categorizing themselves were not demeaning or criticizing these traditions. Quite the opposite. They were looking for patterns of practice that demonstrated tracers of remnant strands of what they thought of as proto-religiosity, or an religious stylism that once categorized or characterized religions that predated the axial age, or that could be juxtaposed with the larger developing category of, quote, world religions, or monotheisms, or other specific isms. As a result, it became increasingly commonplace to employ the terms shaman and shamanic as translations into English for whatever local name ritual experts, healers, diviners, or spirit mediums were given in local languages. A phenomenological phenomenon of sorts was created. Was this lazy? Not entirely. Some of it was intentional, particularly on the part of Eliade. It was lazy on the part of Campbell, for sure. I don't just in talking about the methodology of Joseph Campbell's work and the pervasive influence that it's had on society writ large, right? In the creation of a category, the term erased differences. It sought to make intelligible the practice of disparate traditions by providing a recognizable term that could be used to draw connections between indigenous religions. In so doing, inadvertently or intentionally, it maintained a generalized category of so-called primitive religions, with the supplanting of the term primitive with the term shamanic. While perhaps admirably critiquing the concept of primitive and terms like witch doctor or sorcerer, some of the folks who set out early roadmaps of the field of comparative religion ended up by providing alternative categories such as shamanism that in fact began to just as problematically adhere. In reality, of course, the Naxi of Yunnan province do not share the same religious practices or traditions as the Walpiri in the Northern Territory of Australia, or the Cherokee of what is today known as North Carolina. Eliade, and more so Campbell, have been roundly criticized for their problematic methodologies of, on the one hand, drawing causal connections between geographically distant traditions without prioritizing the local context of meaning-making that defined and interpreted practices. Instead, employing categorical terminology to weave patterns of similarity between things they perceived as being similar. On the other hand, their data was often poor and unreliable, produced from colonialist anthropological lenses and not attuned to local voices or perspectives. Wendy Doniger may be right that the biggest problem with Eliade was that he was more often than not correct. But even after the field of comparative religion moved well past Eliade and onto Smith, Doniger, Patton, and hundreds of others, the damage was done. Critiques of early constructions of the category of shaman were read mostly by specialists and had far less influence than Joseph Campbell continued to have. As Dr. Tao Thikier McKev noted yesterday at this conference in his excellent, by the way, check it out, discussion of the toxic masculinity of the Viking warrior phenomenon, and I'm quoting Dr. Tao's presentation, "I'm not sure challenging authenticity or calling out misuse will challenge toxic cultures." End quote. I'm under no illusions that my entreaty for us to stop using the term shaman, shamanism, and shamanic, except in very specific circumstances, will make waves, particularly in larger Americana. I do hope that the scholarly world can adjust, and perhaps that will engender gradual change. After all, we started the problem. Perhaps we can be part of the cure. Initially, a scholarly misnomer predicated on a romanticization of the primitive, shamanism has evolved to be a culturally appropriated term that continues to harm Indigenous communities. To what degree is the harm twofold, both misapplied and then appropriated? How do we best wrestle with Indigenous ownership of the moniker shamanism by Indigenous peoples far afield from the term's home context? While it can be valuable for Indigenous people to query, problematize, or perhaps rethink the concept of indigeneity itself, for example, I turn you to Robin Wall Kimmerer's work, how can we best move forward with the aspirational dynamic of validating and legitimizing alternative and new spiritualities when appropriation of the term shamanism alongside the appropriation of Indigenous and Native spirituality remains so acutely harmful? This issue is somewhat distinct from other dynamics of appropriation, particularly when the practices are not understood as culturally specific or exclusivist, such as, for example, yoga, meditation practices, or martial arts, although we should always be careful and attuned to issues of power and respect. Folks here are probably aware that Sherpa is an ethnicity, not a job description. I'm concerned about the idea of anyone, let alone me, telling people what to call themselves. I'm more comfortable suggesting that folks use the Naxi term domba to describe Naxi ritual experts instead of shaman. However, I think it's really messy and ugly for me to say to someone, "You're not a shaman." At a conference on the evolution of spirituality, folks in attendance here today are probably more likely than the average bear to value and validate individual people's self-descriptors. And hopefully we're attuned to such problems as white dudes with academic privilege getting all power trippy about indigeneity or identity. I would, though, like to offer a few cautionaries. First, where does shamanism exist I would argue that the locus classic shamanism is in southern and central Siberia, trickling down to Mongolia and Korea, maybe perhaps down to the Himalayas, and then up to maybe circumpolar regions. And that's about it, right? I think the term fits there in terms of the aspects of, again, some of the valuable things that Eliade was pointing out, some of the categories of shamanism that if you were to sort of lay out a map of all of the possible things that shamanism might be, the things that fit most of those categories, the tightest, is probably that region, right? Beyond that, you're stretching the term, you're diluting the term, it becomes an umbrella term and it loses its meaning and its value. Number two, in almost all cases, shamans do not choose to be shamans. Similar to oracles, you don't want to be an oracle. People don't go take courses on how to be an oracle in places where there actually are oracles. Electing to take a training course in Santa Barbara to learn how to become a shaman is offensive. 3, we do in fact have access to the terminology Indigenous peoples use to describe and define their religious, spiritual, and ritual experts and practices. We can use them, use those terms. 4, if we follow the Levi-Straussian Eliadian trajectory of terminological movement from primitive to shamanic, we must be careful about the term indigenous. Indigeneity has become a political term of spectacular importance to Indigenous peoples, but its boundaries are fraught with dynamics of power. And number 5, cultural appropriation, after all, has everything to do with power and agency. People can do whatever they wish and call themselves whatever they wish. But it's important that folks understand that some people may find it offensive or nonsensical when people identify as a shaman. I'm intrigued by Rune Rasmussen's call for renewed, revived Nordic indigeneity and Kimmerer's thesis about, quote, becoming indigenous. One of the crucial elements about each of these ideas, though, has to do with digging into one's own cultural roots, one's own cultural traditions, and not those of others. Appreciating and being inspired by wisdom is distinct from decontextualized appropriation. Claiming foreign indigenous shamanism as part of one's own identity is appropriation. Moreover, I dearly hope that the scholarly community can stop using the terms shaman or shamanism to describe people or traditions simply because the people are indigenous and might not have a name or ism attached to their religious worldview. We should stop using the terms to erase difference. Obviously, the correlate problem becomes the definition of the term religion in the first place. Whatever else it might be, after all, the use of the term shamanism parallels the pattern of employing the taxonomic category of religion from the power and point of view of the neo-colonial imaginary. When we refer to religious or spiritual actors and traditions in other parts of the world, let's use local names, terms, and strive to understand how these terms are constructed locally and why. Thank you.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, President and Fellows of Harvard College.